I am Professor Cindy Rosenthal in the Department of Drama and Dance at Hofstra University, and I am thrilled to be able to host and moderate tonight's program. I'm going to be admitting some people as we go along because we're still in our opening moments, but I am more than excited to say that our special guest tonight is Cantor Lynn Torgove, a dear colleague and friend of mine, whose presentation is titled The Unsinkable Molly Pecan from Burlesque to Beloved Bubbeleh. And we're going to begin in a few minutes, but I wanted to thank a few folks that are here and or are supporting us that must be named. And some of those people are in the room, some are not at this moment, but Athaline Collins and Carol Mallison from Hofstra's Cultural Center were indispensable in putting together this program. We also could not have this event no possible way without the support of the Dorothy and Elmer Kirsch Endowment for the Cultural Center. Also, we would not be here without the Jewish Studies program at Hofstra and Hofstra's University Relations Department. All right, we're still admitting people, so I'm loath to begin the program this moment. I just want to say we have people in this room who hail from as far away as California and Florida. And of course, we have a lot of folks that are much more local than that. Lynn Torgove and her assistant and our stage manager for this evening are zooming in from the Boston area. So we are very well geographically represented. I think I'm going to start with a bio of my dear friend and colleague, Lynn Torgove, who again we're thrilled that she's here with us now, and this is not her first visit. Actually, this is her second visit to Hofstra's Jewish Studies program as a special guest. Cantor Lynn Torgove is the director of the cantorial program at Hebrew College. She is also the founding artistic director of Kol Erev, which is its chamber choir, and has produced performances in venues and synagogues throughout the greater Boston area. Cantor Torgove is a Tufts University graduate. Woo woo, jumbos. And I'm a Tufts University graduate as well, and also a graduate of the Boston University School of Music. She has performed as a soloist in opera, in concerts, and in chamber music across Europe, North America, and Japan. This past summer, she had a principal role in A Handmaid's Tale, the opera produced by Boston Lyric Opera. And it was an extraordinary production. I have to say I was very fortunate I was able to see that. As a stage director, she's produced productions across the country. Lynn Torgove was artistic stage director of the dramatic concert Shining Through Broken Glass, which commemorated the 70th anniversary of Kristallnacht. This took place in Providence, Rhode Island, and featured Leonard Nimoy as a performer. Cantor Torgove has served Temple Emmanuel in Marblehead, Massachusetts for over 25 years. Just a quick word about our support tech team, Jessica Wolf-Silverberg, who is an extraordinarily successful on our behalf stage manager, is a cantorial student finishing her degree at Hebrew College, and she also finished her degree at Oberlin Musical Conservatory. So now I hope we have everybody in the room. Without further ado, I am delighted to present for you Cantor Lynn Torgove and her program, The Unsinkable Molly Pecan from Burlesque to Beloved Bubbeleh. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone who has put this wonderful program together and done such wonderful work in this area. And thank you, a special thank you to you, Cindy, for inviting me again to be part of this series, which I am very proud to be part of. I get to talk about one of my favorite people and one of my most favorite musicians and forces of nature. Molly Picon was a force of nature. Now, in 2016, there was an exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York exploring the connections between the Yiddish theater of the 19th century Eastern Europe and the Lower East Side.
Chatting. Moderator.
To the giants of modern American entertainment. New York's Yiddish theater, from the Bowery to Broadway. The exhibit traced the roads of Yiddish theater as it left its roots as traveling troupes of singers and actors performing for poor Jewish audiences in Europe, and ended up in New York City on the Lower East Side, performing for sweatshop workers and pushcart peddlers. The exhibit showed posters and costumes from Funny Girl, in which Barbra Streisand played the role of Fanny Brice, the great Jewish comedienne who got her start on the Lower East Side. There was also a rumpled Tevye outfit from Fiddler on the Roof, making the connection to the Yiddish stories of Shalom Aleichem. By the mid-1920s, New York was the world capital of Yiddish theater, with 14 theaters, half of them along Second Avenue. The exhibit covered the great performers of those years: Jacob Adler, the Thomas Chevskys, Maurice Schwartz, and Molly Picon. They ran non-stop clips of Molly Picon playing a girl dressed as a boy in the 1937 film of Yiddle Mitten Fiddle, or Yiddle with the Fiddle.
Lynn, I want to interrupt for 1 second.
Yes.
I'm getting a request that you increase your volume. Is that
Indeed.
a possibility?
Absolutely.
All right.
Give me one moment.
Or speak into the microphone.
Both of those
How
things.
is this?
Much better.
Good.
Yay.
Yay,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you.
So we didn't hear what you said before.
At
Oh.
all? Did everybody not hear me?
I heard you, but I don't know if I'm alone in that.
We heard people did not.
I heard you.
I heard you.
I
heard you.
I
heard you.
I heard you.
People to turn up their volume.
I heard you.
I
But
heard
let me
you.
bump it just a little bit.
Loud and clear.
The receiving person's volume.
Okay, from this point forward, Lynn will be a little louder, and I hope everybody can hear a little better.
By the mid-1920s, New York was the world capital of Yiddish theater, with 14 theaters, half of them along Second Avenue.
This is you. So,
I don't hear it now.
And helped keep the Yiddish theater alive. Best known for her portrayals of the Yiddish waif, the adorable waif, in Yiddish plays and musicals. She also acted, sang, and danced her way through English plays and appeared on film, television, and Broadway. Here is Molly Picon being interviewed by the talk show host Mike Douglas in 1980.
You know, besides starring in hit Broadway musicals like Milk and Honey and movies like Fiddler on the Roof, my next guest also spent her early years on the vaudeville stage and, of course, is one of the biggest stars of the Yiddish theater. She fit a lot of living into one life, and she fitted all between the covers of this book. Here is super senior Molly Picon. I like your outfit.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That
Nice.
is nice.
Beautiful.
Did you design that, Molly?
No, Eduardo is my tailor, and he makes these things special for me, so I can sit down in them comfortably.
You look wonderful.
Well, here I am with the boys.
The boy. You and your late husband Yanko went to Poland, remember?
Yes.
And he introduced you to his mother.
Mm-hmm.
Tell that story. That's so wonderful. It's in
Well,
your book. And
his mother was an Orthodox Jewess. She had never been in a theater. She'd never seen a theater, and she didn't know what it was all about. And so Yanko tried to explain to her that our profession is just like the people in religion. They preach to people, but we sing to people, and it's the same thing. So she said, "Sing for me." So I sang. Don't write a letter to your mother. You shouldn't be proud if you have mom, and you shouldn't be proud with money. And all these beautiful songs. And she cried and she laughed, and then she said, "My God," she said, "that is beautiful." She said, "But are the American Jews so dumb that they pay money for that?"
we're coming right back with Molly Pecan.
In many ways, Molly Pecan was the bellwether of assimilation, cultural negotiation, and evolution in the Eastern European Jew in America. But she was different from many of the performers in the early Yiddish theater. She was born in America and went back to Eastern Europe to learn her theatrical and linguistic craft. Because of that difference, she was the perfect mayor of the city, straddling both sides of the cultural divide. Molly Pecan was a quintessential American Jew, reflecting the complex journey of Jews in America in the 20th century. In Joshua Walden's article, he says, Molly Pecan, the darling of Second Avenue, he begins with this quote: "My grandparents came from a little town in Russia that looked a lot like a sneeze in print, and it was pronounced the same way, near Kiev, Russia." With this joke, actress and vaudevillian Molly Pecan also began her first memoir, So Laugh a Little, emphasizing her Eastern Jewish roots as well as her American outlook on this heritage. Later in the article, Mr. Walden describes Molly Pecan as a crossover artist. I don't think that this is an accurate term. She didn't cross over from one thing to the other. She embodied both sides of the divide. Now here you see little Molly. Her parents called her Molly Dolly. She was born Margaret Picon on February 28th, 1898, on the Lower East Side of New York City on Broome Street. She was raised along with her sister Helen by her mother, Clara Ostrovsky, later Ostroff. Her mother had left Ukraine in 1890, just ahead of the pogroms, traveling to America with her 11 brothers and sisters, her mother and father, and a feather bed and a samovar. Molly's father, Louis Picon, later Picon, had studied for the rabbinate in Warsaw. Besides studying in Warsaw, he also, it was later discovered, had left a wife and children behind in Warsaw. He was largely estranged from his American daughters. Molly Pecan recounts that she thought her father was disappointed that she had been a girl. She says, as for Papa, well, Papa was disdainful of life in general, and I think of me in particular. He never worked. He was just too educated to do menial labor. Basically, he was just anti-capitalist, anti-religion, anti-labor, and anti-girls. He just faded out of our lives. Never did he ever hug or kiss Helen or me. I was, and still am sorry, we never really knew Papa. Well, after his second daughter, Helen, was born, he left the family. And after he left, Molly, Helen, and their mother, Clara, moved to Philadelphia. Clara was a wonderful seamstress and found work in the costume departments of Philadelphia's Yiddish theaters, sewing costumes for chorus girls, comedians, and some of the stars of the Yiddish theater. Scene 2, Molly's stage debut. Molly had her theatrical debut at age 5. Look at this photo. When her mother entered her in an amateur acting competition at the Bijou Theater in Philadelphia. She was already adept at singing and dancing, as she was gifted at funny little impressions that she made. Her mother must have thought that she had some talent. So the story of that fateful audition performance for the competition goes like this. Molly and her mother rode the trolley to the competition. Now she's 5 years old. She's dressed in a red pleated dress with a fake muff fur. She must have looked like a little doll, Molly Dolly, like the one in the photo. On their way to the theater, on a trolley, a drunk riding in the same car demanded that Molly perform her act for him. Then, well, she took the dare, and she performed her number and spontaneously ended her performance with an impression of the drunk himself. Impressed, he collected pennies from his fellow passengers to give to Molly. Now, Molly arrives at the theater with her mother, and when it's time for her to try out her act for the contest, she concludes it with an impromptu impression of the drunken man she met on the trolley earlier in the day. She took first prize, and so began her career. When she arrived home, she reports that her grandma nodded her head and said quietly, "Clara, there are maybe 5 or 6 theaters in Philadelphia. Better you should keep her on the trolley cars." Molly became a featured act in Jewish theaters all over Philadelphia. Here you can see her in a Nickelodeon vaudeville act in a show called Fagin's Decision. She still has that, what an amazing hat she's wearing. She made childhood appearances in Yiddish variety shows and vaudeville and became thoroughly integrated into the life of the Yiddish theater, although she largely performed in English, not Yiddish. Molly spent her youth on stage performing spunky song and dance routines in All American Amateur Nights, local Nickelodeon theater acts, the Columbia Yiddish Theater, and trolley cars. I think, there we go. She made appearances all over Philadelphia. She even performed with Michael Tomaszewski's Yiddish repertory troupe at the Arch Theater in Philadelphia, where at the age of 15, she appeared in Uncle Tom's Cabin with alternate performance in Yiddish and English. By the time she was 16, she felt she had to leave William Penn High School before graduation. Although she wanted to stay in school, she was exhausted performing at night and then going to school each morning. She decided to pursue a full-time stage career instead. She writes in her autobiography, "Perhaps if I had been Louis Picon's son, I would have had a classical education and been a scholar. Instead, as the wardrobe mistress's daughter, I got a love of the stage because there I could make believe I was all the things I could never be in real life." Scene 3. Molly hits the vaudeville touring road and heads to Boston. The vaudevillian combination of singing, dancing, and ebullient comic impressions would remain a central feature of her act throughout her career. Indeed, she even revived her mimicry of the trolley car drunk in a scene from her musical film, Yiddle Mitten Fiddle from 1936. Now, Molly wanted to expand her theatrical career beyond Philadelphia, and eventually in 1918, she was cast in a touring English vaudeville performance called The Four Seasons. And there is Molly. You can see her. She's right in the middle. She played the part of Winter. The Four Seasons toured mostly small-time vaudeville circuits, including the Gus Sun Circuit, mid-sized cities and small towns in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and the Ackerman and Harris Circuit, sounds like a railroad company, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, California, and British Columbia, also known as the Death Trail, because it took acts a long time to travel between theaters while they hoped for their big break and better bookings. Performing alongside the Four Seasons were a trained SEAL act, an acrobatic troupe, and a rooster. I guess animal acts were a big thing there. Can't believe it was the same rooster that went all the way across the country with them. A rooster with a stovepipe hat that acted like a drunkard. Now, the next chapter starts. Nearly broke from the tour, the Four Seasons arrived in Boston in the winter of 1918. Because we are all living in the middle of a pandemic now. We all know what was happening in Boston in 1918, the Spanish flu epidemic. When Molly and the Four Seasons arrived in Boston, the tour had to shut down, and Molly now had no work and not enough money to buy her train ticket to get her home to Philadelphia. Every theater in the city was closed because of the pandemic. Every theater but one, the Grand Opera House. It wasn't very grand, actually, by the time that we got to it. The authorities had just overlooked it. Now, for those of you that know Boston, the theater was located on Washington Street, underneath the elevated trolley, and neither the neighborhood or the theater were very grand. It was a rundown, second-rate theater surrounded by brothels. The Yiddish theater performances there happened in between wrestling matches and cockfights. No wonder the authorities missed it. It was the only Yiddish theater. It was the only theater at all in town. Molly headed over there to look for a loan for a train fare or for a job. Now here we go, scene 4, falling in love for life. That sounds like the name of a song, doesn't it? When she got there to the theater, she met Jacob Kalick, the manager of the theater. Jacob was also the person that hung the stage lights, built the set, paid the bills, did the casting. He did everything. It turns out that the company was looking for a new member of the troupe, a flamme feierlich zu breiten, a lively ingenue. Well, Molly got the part. I know I'm giving away the end of the chapter of this story, but it's the only photo I could find of Jacob. There he is. Molly describes him in her autobiography as a tall, skinny, schleppedicke, yeshiva bocher. He looked like he'd been wearing the same clothes for the last 3 months. I think maybe those were the only clothes that he had. Jacob Kalick was born in 1891 and died in 1975, and Molly called him Yonkel. He was also a Yiddish theater actor, director, and playwright. Jacob immediately saw Molly's potential as a star performer. He was 7 years her senior, better educated and more experienced, and apparently knew talent when he saw it. The acting troupe at the Grand Opera House had some very promising members who would later become prominent members in both Yiddish and English-speaking theater. Maybe you'll recognize their names. Paul Muni and Menashe Skolnick. Kalick, I love this. Kalick was a Polish immigrant. He was born in Galicia. We should tell our rabbinical students at Hebrew College about this, Jessica. He had originally trained to become a rabbi. When a traveling theater troupe came into his town, they were in need of costumes, and Jacob helped the ensemble out by looking for local clothing that might suit their needs. He loved working with these performers so much. Imagine what his mother had to say about this, that he ran off and joined the acting company, from rabbinical studies to the theater. Oy, mama. And Jacob fell in love with Molly that year. Molly tells some wonderful stories about their courtship, but you'll have to check them out in her autobiography. In less than a year, she married Kalick. He proposed to her in 5 different languages and in broken English. They announced their engagement on stage and were married on June 29th, 1919, in the back of a grocery store. The bride's dress was made by Mama Clara from a theater curtain. The perfect theatrical couple. In 1919, when she married Kalick, he became her lifelong lover and manager. She says in her autobiography, "I always said that influenza was our matchmaker. I was the all-American girl and absolutely illiterate about Jewish culture. Yonkel, on the other hand, was the complete intellectual who knew not only classical Yiddish, but its plays, theaters, and writers. It was a funny situation. I was trying to make him a real American guy, and he was trying to make me a Yiddish mama. During that same year, now we moved to scene 5, off to Europe. During the next year, Molly suffered a heartbreaking miscarriage and was told that she would be unable to bear children. She was devastated. Yankel, Jacob Kalik, suggested that the two of them head to Europe for an extended tour. He felt that she was too American to achieve success on New York's Second Avenue. Indeed, she had been unable to be cast in anything on Second Avenue. Yankel wanted to take Molly to Europe so that she could learn more about the people and settings depicted in the songs and scripts of the Yiddish theater. She says, to perfect my Yiddish, to get my star legs, and not to be inhibited by working with people who knew me. Yiddish was our center, our link, and I never felt like a complete stranger in Europe because I was always in the midst of a familiar language and heritage, the Yiddish world. I knew very little about the characters I was supposed to portray or about the customs. What I needed was to steep myself in the atmosphere and background of my people. Here was Molly, who considered herself the all-American girl and acknowledged, the Yiddish I spoke was completely bastardized. Her journey to Europe was thus an effort to achieve the sense of authenticity, linguistic fluency, and social and cultural knowledge that so many of her contemporary stars of the American Yiddish theater possessed by virtue of their European training. Now, they performed shows that Kalik wrote all over Europe, from Vilna to Romania. The relationship that she formed with these audiences and her new understanding of Yiddish laid the foundation of the rest of her career. Those theaters and their American relatives, children and grandchildren, would return again and again to see her perform. In other words, Molly had to go to Europe to make a big audience, and the audience fell in love with her. And there was such great communication between the American and the European Jewish world that they wrote back to their relatives and said, you have got to see Molly Picon when she gets to Second Avenue. And indeed she did. Scene 6, coming home a star. Now, Molly was ready to make a name for herself on the stage of Second Avenue. They returned to New York, and from 1922 to 1925, she worked every major Yiddish theater in town with every major composer, including Joseph Ruptures and Abe Elstein. I must tell you that it's often overlooked that even though she worked with the greatest Yiddish theater composers, Molly was a great lyricist and wrote many, many of the songs that she sang, the lyrics for those. Now, her debut in Yankel, 1920, Molly and Yankel teamed up with this composer, Joseph Rumshinsky, to create operettas scripted and directed by Kalik, and often by Pecan. Dressed as a 13-year-old yeshiva bacher, a yeshiva student, Pecan took on what she described as a Peter Pan role with a slight difference. Whereas Peter Pan doesn't want to grow up, Yankel wants desperately to grow up and make a better world for our people and all people. Molly often exaggerated that she performed this role 3,000 times. It must have felt that way. She starred in many productions up and down Second Avenue. You can see them here. Weighing 4'11" and 95 pounds, she took the Yiddish theater by storm. She appeared in many productions up and down the avenue. Mamala, Maisel, The Girl from Yesterday, The Radio Girl. Oh, girl, it's a frequent word in these titles. Oh, is dos a Maisel. Oh, what a girl. And, this is my favorite, The Circus Girl, in which Pecan dangled by 1 foot from a rope. She even took acrobatic lessons in order to make this work. She stretched her physical humor to real gymnastics, training for months to learn to climb a rope way up to the flies, where I fanned out to the audience 1 foot in a noose and my arms spread out like bird's wing, just in this picture. I did a split and twirled around 40 feet into the flies. Then I slowly climbed back down the rope, all to Rumshinsky's music. Rather than being met on her return to solid ground with an anticipated applause, Pecan recalled, her audience heaved one big sigh of relief. Now we move into Act 2. Molly brings her boxing gloves to the shtetl. Ost und West. Molly's first films were silent movies made in Europe. She debuted in Das Judenmädel by Otto Freuster, filmed in Austria in 1921, followed by Hutet eure Tochter, which had no Jewish content in 1922. But it was Kalik's Yiddish film, Ost und West, in 1923, East and West, also known as Mizrach and Mariv, that she really made her mark. Ost und West is the oldest surviving Yiddish film. It is a comic commentary on the modern Western American Jew, perfect for Molly, and the antiquated old-fashioned Eastern European Jew. Written by Kalik and directed by Ivan Abramson and Sidney Golden and filmed in Vienna, Pecan plays an American flapper who is dragged by her father, who was born in Poland, back to the old country for a wedding. I must say that Kalik wrote this, and Molly performs as she is in real life, the American flapper, the all-American girl. And Kalik also stars in the film as the yeshiva bocher who falls hopelessly in love with Molly. You're going to see him in just a few minutes. Molly is shocked and often disgusted by the Jews that she sees. She mocks them, she teases them, and she questions their traditions. You can see here in this first photo from Ost und West, she is very dubious about all of these yeshiva bochers that are with her. In this scene, coming up next, she teaches them how to dance the Charleston. This is her husband, Yankel, coming up. He's in love with Molly. This is her aunt. And her uncle. It's so interesting to see Molly Picon in a silent movie when we're so used to her as an amazing singer.
Lynn, could you tell us the date of that film? Do you know the date of it?
Yes, I do. 1923.
Wow.
Yeah, 1923. Now, later in the film, Molly participates in a day of Yom Kippur praying and fasting. You have to find this movie. It's just great. You can see the whole thing. She sits in the women's section with a paperback romance novel tucked into the pages of her Machzor, or Yom Kippur prayer book. When she is too bored to stand it anymore, she heads to the kitchen. And do you have the one before that, Jessica?
No.
Okay. In the kitchen, she eats. That's all right. In the kitchen, she devours all of the food reserved for the break fast. And at the end of Yom Kippur. And what she doesn't eat, she gives to the family dogs. Later, after the services are over, the family comes in to prepare the breakfast meal and finds all of the food gone. Molly's aunt is furious with her. Now here you see, there's Molly's aunt. So Molly is so angry at being chastised and punished that she goes to her room, gets her boxing gloves that she had brought all the way from America, comes back to the kitchen and knocks out her aunt. I have to take a look at this again. She brought her boxing gloves to Europe. I think that's crazy that she brought her boxing gloves to Poland. Now, for a final jest, Molly decides to stage a fake wedding to tease the yeshiva boy who is in love with her. And we see the wedding photo. Now, she thinks that it's a fake wedding, but it turns out that it was a real wedding, and she actually becomes his wife. Molly is horrified. She is allowed to leave Poland for 2 years on the condition that she return to her husband. When she gets back, an erudite, educated, handsome scholar comes to call on her in Vienna. Molly falls head over heels for him immediately. And it turns out that the man is actually her yeshiva boy husband, completely and perfectly secularized. So here you see that in Ost und West, you have a comic and satirical and kind of wicked take on both the American ignorance and flapper culture that Molly represents and the backward, old-fashioned, I think they look foolish, the European Jews in Poland, the religious Jews. What they end up with in Vienna is something that's in between, the educated European. Yankel becomes a scholar of classical Jewish, it doesn't call it Jewish, of Eastern European Jewry, and lectures all over Austria. So I guess it seems like that's the desired middle ground. Now I'd like to take a little break here and ask from all of you, many people, if you have any questions. And I guess they can put them in a chat room. How do you want to do that, Cindy?
Yeah, so I can look at the chat, or you can, I think, Lynn, I'm not sure, but I'm happy to also, if you want to raise.
Oh, I can see it.
Good. Okay. So we see a question. Molly seems attracted to the secular world. Was she anti-religion is a question.
It's a great, great question. I had this conversation with several people just the other day. Molly was not anti-religion, but she was not raised in a religious home. She was raised in a very secular home. She was raised in a Yiddish secular home. So what became important to her was Yiddishkeit, all Yiddishkeit. She was never anti-religious, but it wasn't something that she had practiced in her home. And as a theater musician, as a theater performer, it wasn't something that she practiced in her life either. Now, it's very interesting that in many of the Yiddish theater productions of the early years, there was almost always some religious ceremony. There was always a bar mitzvah. Of course, there were no bat mitzvahs. There was always a bar mitzvah, or there was a Purim spiel, or there was a sukkah on Sukkot, or as in the jazz singer, if you remember, there's Yom Kippur with the cantor singing Kol Nidre. This was an indication, I think, that many of the Yiddish immigrants that were coming from Eastern Europe were also not religious, but they had a great fondness for the religion of their home country, their mother country. So they came to the theater to be religious. And the people that were constructing, directing, writing these musicals knew that, which is why there was always something of Jewish religion on the stage. Now, also, you'll see, actually, that you don't see it in the film Bubbeleh from 1938. There is a full-blown Passover Seder in the ghetto area where the Jews are happening. It's in the courtyard, and the women are serving all the men. There must be, I don't know, 40, 50 men in eating outside in a Seder. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. It's not a Seder. It's Sukkot, and it's outside, so they're sitting in a sukkah. Seders happen in other productions, but not in this one. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it describes what her relationship was, I think, with Judaism.
I think that was a wonderful, wonderful question, but there's another really interesting question in the chat. Did Molly's work ever comment on political controversial topics of the time period?
No, but they did comment on cultural aspects. I think it's very important to recognize that Molly Pecan, who often played a boy, who played a girl, who played a boy, there was commentary going on about sexual identity and gender. Now, it wasn't in a political way. It wasn't the kind of gender bending that was happening in cabarets in Europe, but it was announcing that in some ways you could only be successful if you were a woman playing a boy. But she belies that because she was an incredibly successful woman, writing her own lyrics and really running her own career. But political, no. She was very involved politically, though, I have to say. She performed for the USO, she performed for the troops, she was very involved in charity during World War II, and at the end, she and her husband went to the DP camps in Europe and performed for them. She went to South Africa, but her performances had nothing that was overtly political.
There are other questions in the, there was one question that is slightly off topic, but you might know the answer. One gentleman asks where she went to elementary school. Do you know? Because this gentleman went to PS 92 on the Lower East Side on Broome Street. Do you happen to know where she went to elementary school?
Well, I have to say that she didn't go to elementary school in New York City because they moved to Philadelphia when she was 5 years old. So any schooling that she had at all, I'm not really sure what schooling she did have, would have taken place in Philadelphia. But I'm sorry, maybe she would have gone to PS 92 on Broome Street if she'd stayed in New York.
I'm wondering if any of the students in my current Jewish studies class, which is titled Jewish Identities and Experience on Stage, do any one of you have a question? Because we've been talking about Jewish identities and especially women who try to resist the stereotypes that are sometimes associated with Jewish women and resist the barriers and the walls that have been put up at various times throughout history in the United States. So I wondered if any of the members of my class would want to leap in with anything that they noticed about images or something we've learned about the life of Molly Pecan. And you don't have to leap in, but I wanted to open that possible door to you all. I do see another question in the meantime. Did she ever visit the British Mandate of Palestine, which is modern day Israel?
Yes, she did. She was a Zionist. And very involved and devoted to Israel. She performed Yiddish theater in Israel. Now, the interesting thing about that is that she performed Yiddish theater, I think it was before, I'm sure it was before 44. She performed Yiddish theater in Israel when the official language was Hebrew. Nobody was allowed to perform in anything but Hebrew. And Molly resisted. So Molly performed in Yiddish. She really broke a huge taboo and insisted that Yiddish be spoken and heard and sung in Palestine. She later adopted, they were already rather grown up. She adopted 2 children who lived in Israel. So she was devoted to Israel.
That's fascinating. I see another question about her. Did she ever have any work time with Jacob Adler? She may have known him, but did she also perform with him?
Oh, no. Jacob Adler thought that everything that was going on in the Yiddish theater musical world was shunt. Now that word, you can imagine what that word shunt means. It means crap. And he gave it no attention at all because Jacob Adler was the great Jacob Adler who brought Shakespeare in Yiddish to the Yiddish stage. The musicals in the Yiddish musicals, I would say really right through the 90s and the early 2000s of our generations were looked on as stock kind of soap opera pieces of fluff that satisfied the working class, those poor, uneducated Yiddish shopkeepers that were down on the Lower East Side. So no, Jacob Adler had.
So, it's interesting.
They may have met later, but.
What about, so there were obviously other famous Jewish performers, including entertainers like Al Jolson and Eddie Cantor. Was she ever in any performance context with them?
I don't know that she was in any performance context with them, but she, of course, knew them all. As you could see that George Jessel, who was on the Mike Douglas show, they were like brother and sister. They were brother and sister. They were all a big family.
I love that. So someone on the chat has said that they see a similarity between Molly Picon and the marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which of course is in everybody's mind when we think about, young Jewish women. So has that connection ever occurred to you before, Lynn?
Well, Jessica and I were just talking about it.
I talked, as Lynn and I were preparing this conversation, this presentation, that was one of the first things I said to her, is that nowadays when we see this kind of a character, we think of the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And I was actually just about to write this in the chat, if you don't mind, a little piece of trivia that I love, because we were, Cantor Torgove was talking about how the Yiddish theater always had like these life cycle religious events happening. Well, the melody for Avinu Malkeinu that most Jews sing during the High Holy Days comes from the Yiddish theater. It comes from the music. It comes from the music that from the operetta that was an adaptation of Isaac Bashevis Singer's Yosha Kaub. So just in terms of how what's happened in the Yiddish theater has come into modern American Jewish life, like that's one remnant that's still there that I just love.
Thank you for that. That is fantastic information, I have to say. And now there is a member of my class who has a question, and it's a wonderful one. And
but can I say just one thing about the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel?
Go ahead. Yeah.
The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel was taking place in the 50s.
Right.
Molly Picon was doing the same thing in 1922. So there you go. Yes.
No, that's amazing. And in fact, the image that you showed in that film of her shaking her stuff, I mean, who could imagine a woman in her 20s, in the 1920s doing that? So the question from a member of my class is, would you say she popularized the idea of Jewish secularity in America, or was she solely an example of the many at the time who yearned to assimilate rather than stand out, both culturally and religiously?
It's a great question. I will say that the word a secular Jew wasn't really around in the 1920s. You were a Jew. You were identified as a Jew. It didn't matter whether you practiced or you didn't practice. You were there was bias against you as a Jew. You were Yids together. So the idea of a secular Jew, I mean, I used the term secular Jew when we were talking about Austin West, because the Eastern European kind of davening Jew and the American Jew was still, it was part of the 20s ethos. But I use the word secular. And I don't think anybody used the word secular in the 1920s because everybody was a Yid and it was all about Yiddishkeit.
Great answer. Let's see. So there's a question about her films, and someone asks, do you know of a film, a tearjerker called Der Schwieger, the mother-in-law?
I have not seen, in all of my research, I haven't seen that, but now I'm going to go looking for it. And speaking of films, we're going to move on to her musical films now, which made a huge impact, a huge impact. So let's go back to, is that's all right? To
yes,
go back?
Of course,
yeah,
absolutely.
Now, we're going to be talking about the films that came later. The next film that, here, let me close the chat room. The next film that had a huge impact was actually 13 years later. This is scene 2 of Act 2. Boy meets girl meets Little Mitten Fiddle. It was the most important film. And it's interesting that it was made so much farther away from the silent films. Joseph Green, a very, very famous director, was a Polish-born Jew who had emigrated to the United States, directed Yiddle, and it was the most commercially successful musical in the history of Yiddish film. Molly Pecan, Yiddle is the story of a young girl from the Polish town Kazimierz who dresses up as a boy so she and her father can earn a living as traveling musicians, a field, of course, traditionally closed to women. Now, I have to say, I hope you can see this because Joseph Green, it was revolutionary in a way. He took documentary footage of the Polish countryside and the Polish shtetl in 1936 and integrated it into the films with the actors and performers. So when you look at scenes from this, the opening scene is a stunning montage of a shtetl and a market. So you see the market, you see everybody in the market, you see people selling things, you see people on the field as the hay wagon goes by. It's stunning, and it was really quite something. Now, what happens is her father, Molly's father, is thrown out of his apartment, and in order to make money, they decide to go on the road as klezmorim, as musicians. In order for that to happen, her father says, well, you've got to dress as a little boy because you're a girl and it will be too dangerous for you out on the road. So she puts on pants, she puts on an adorable little hat, and they take their fiddle and their bass and they actually get on a big hay wagon, and Molly sings this song. Now, this song, unfortunately, has no orchestra accompaniment, but you'll have to imagine it. Okay. Now I see Cindy's face. Can everybody see me?
Yes, we can see you.
All right, good. All right, so here's the song, Yiddle Mitten Fiddle. Give myself an A down here. Überfällte Wegen auf verwogen Hey, mit Sonnen im Donnerregen, fahren Gleismer 2. Ach Yiddish, sag mir sehnen 2. Yiddle mitten Fiddle, Arjen mitten Bass, das Nadi Riesen Lieder, wo Suche sein im Kass. Hey, Yiddle, Fiddle, Schmiedel, hey, das Leben ist ein Spaß. Beugel fliegt am Morgen, geht morgen und geht hier, dem Teuer und die Sorgen zu alle schwarze Jahr, dem wilde Nacht, dem Brunnen und jede Schur. Jede mitten Fädel, Arjen mitten Bass, das Leben ist ein Liedl, das wuschet seinen Kass. Hey, Liedl, Smiedl, das Leben ist ein Spaß. Jede mitten Fädel, Arjen mitten Bass, das Leben ist ein Liedl, das wuschet sich den Kass. Hey, Liedl, Smiedl, das Leben ist ein Spaß. As the foursome travels through the Polish countryside, Yidel laments that she can't, that she let's see, one second, sorry, all. Everything is going along just fine, actually. She even fools another father and son duo who they meet making music in another Polish town. Okay, here's where it happens. This is the Yente story. Everybody knows this. She falls in love, of course, with the other son, who is a fabulous violin player. And here's where all four of them are playing in a courtyard. Now I want you to look at the people hanging out of the window, because they're not actors. They're people that live in the town. There he is, he's a handsome guy. That's her father. As you can see, she even fools the other father of this father and son duo, whom they meet making music around the Polish town. They join together for the rest of the movie in a romp through the Polish countryside. But of course, the trouble begins when Molly falls in love with the other son, Froim, his name. And she sings, she laments that she has fallen in love with Froim, you know, short for Ephraim, for Froim. And she sings, Oi, Mama, bin ich verliebt. She says, Oi, Mama, am I in love? And she sings this. When everybody else has gone to sleep, she takes off her hat. Wenn zerspielt sich euch sein Fiddle, schien herzig Yiddish Riddle, oi Mann, wird gut ohne Schier, mit seine schöne schwarze Augen, hat dann mein zu bezeugen, oi Mann, weil gut ist mir. Und wenn sagt, hey, du Mädel, bist doch so ein Label, und sein Schillen kriegt den Herz rein. Will sich tanzen, will sich singen, oi gewaltig wird zu springen. Ohne ihm, oi kann ich mehr nicht sein. Oi, Mama, bin ich verliebt. Oi, Mama, bin ich verliebt. A klezme Jingel, Mama, getreue, liegt mir nur in Sinne. Ich wein und lach und weiß nicht, Mama, auf welche Welt ich bin. Oi, Mama, bin ich verliebt. Oi, Mama, bin ich verliebt. Ich wollte die ganze Welt herumgenommen und zurück zu sich. Oi, Mama, bin ich verliebt. Now, during their travels, oh, thank you, Jessica. During their travels, they end up being wedding musicians. They're the wedding band for a wedding. And Molly says this about filming the scene with the local inhabitants. Hold on one second, Jessica. By the end of the film, she says that it took 30 hours to film this scene because the inhabitants of the town were the guests at the wedding. And they thought they had been invited to a real wedding. So they ate all the food, but then they had to do another take. So they had to set the table again with food, and they were very poor and very hungry, and they ate it all again. And this went on really for 30 hours it took to film this scene. So we wanted to show this to you so that you can see more of the local folk thinking that they were at a wedding, but this is it's a very authentic situation, a very authentic portrayal of a wedding in a small Polish Jewish town. So let's take a look at that. Well, they are. They're going to sit down. They're going to eat all the food. I wonder if the makers of, and I bet they did, the makers of Fiddler on the Roof saw this scene, because there you have to life, l'chaim, right there in 1936. Now, by the end of the film, she has taken off her boy's clothing and made a name for herself as a comic actress in Warsaw. She and Freud meet again by chance on an ocean liner heading for where? America, both in fancy modern dress. The two finally embrace as a dance band plays a hybrid version of their ensemble's klezmer repertoire with added blue notes and set to a Latin beat. Now, scene 3, the last Yiddish film made in Europe. Molly never changes, but Europe grows grotesque. Mamala. Mamala, the Little Mother, made in 1938. Picon and Kalik returned to Poland to film Mamala. Mommy, the Little Mommy. This musical comedy was the last Jewish film made in Poland before the Nazi onslaught. At 40 years old, Pecan plays a young girl of 12, Chwawski, whose mother dies and leaves her to take care of her large and unappreciative and unruly family, a role she had created on the stage 10 years earlier. The film took on special poignancy as she and Kalik struggled to capture the endangered shtetl culture on the eve of World War II. She says in her autobiography, Poland had begun to feel like Germany, hatred of Jews everywhere. The film begins with Molly playing the young daughter in a big family in a Polish city. Her mother has passed away and she's taking care of the family and they don't appreciate her. So in this next film clip, you'll see Molly making Shabbos dinner. Now you'll know this song, Abigazint. It's kind of happens in nightclubs and at bar mitzvahs and weddings as a happy, happy song, but you can see at the end of it, it's not such a happy song, and you'll see why in just a moment. She's a great actress.
A bissel Regen, a ruhig aus dem Kopf zu legen, aber wir sind, können glücklich sein. A Schicha sagt, a Kleid und Lacht, das ein Kästchen, a drei, vier Slottes, aber wir sind, können glücklich sein. Die Luft ist frei vor jedem Gleier, die Sinn, sie scheint vor jedem eine Murmelrei. Bist du freit, a bisschen lachen, a mit freit, a Schnäpsel machen, a wie gesinnt, können glücklich sein. Einer sich das Schier ist, einer sich Gebier ist, einem in die ganze Welt. Einer meint, das ganze Glück hängt nur auf dem Geld. Soll mal siechen, soll mal kriechen, aber ich tracht an mir. Ich darf es auf Kapur ist, weil das Glück steht am Tier. A bissl Sinn, a bissl Regen, a ruhig aus dem Kopf zu legen, a wir sind, können glücklich sein. A Schicha sagt, a Kleid und Lacht ist ein Kästchen, a drei, vier Slottes, a wir sind, können glücklich sein. Speit me neueste Link. Oi, heiß ist heiß mit euch zu halten, als man ist verliebt, flust man auf den Kalten. Oi, weh mir Wasser ist doch nass, heintige Jünglich ist sie gleiben wie ein Hint auf dem Gas. Tinkel, tinkel wie ein Keiler, als man ist verliebt, kriegt man linken Fehler. Oi, Gewalt, de Galle. Ab die sind, können glücklich sein.
You can see that Molly, once again, is, as a girl this time, is the one who's in charge. And she's very sad. She sings later on in this, she falls in love with someone, of course, again, who thinks that he'll never love her. But in the end, he does. And she sings Maisel. She sings, Maisel, no good luck will ever happen to me. But in the end, her family comes around just a little bit, and the violinist who she's in love with falls in love with Molly. Jessica, let's move to the montage of what happens to Molly after after Yiddish begins to move, after Yiddish moves to English and the Jews move to the suburbs. As that happens, Molly follows. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions at the end. There she is. Now here, It's the Second Avenue Theater. You could see that from the cars. The times have changed. She's still performing Rumshinsky. She's still performing with her husband, Abi Gesund. But this is an effort to keep Yiddish theater alive. Now, when Yiddish theater continues to fade, she takes her Yiddishkeit to the airwaves and stars in her own radio show, sponsored by Maxwell House Coffee. I don't know who remembers the Maxwell House Coffee Haggadahs. That's what I grew up with on Passover. Then she goes to the nightclubs. So she performed in nightclubs all over the country in a one-woman show as well. She even makes star appearances in television sitcoms, bringing the Irish cops to the world of Yiddishkeit. Here she is in Car 54, Where Are You? With Fred Gwynn.
There's a holdup in the Bronx, Brooklyn's broken out in fights. There's a traffic jam in Harlem that's backed up to Jackson Heights. There's a scout troop short a child, cruise ships do and idle wild. Car 54, where are you?
Here she has moved into an apartment building before it's finished.
In der Rebelland, kleine Kinderlach, dem alles weiß. In der Rebelland, kleine Kinderlach, der Lojanko, jedem alles weiß. In der Rebelland, kleine Kinderlach, dem alles. Hello. Renta fire. Now you try it.
Often proper chop.
No. Ribbit.
Wait a minute, Rachel. I think I got it. Auf ein Treppencheck brennt ein Feierl, innen Stiebes heiß. In der Rebellerten kleine Kinderlach, dem Olive Base. Hey, Francis, that was good.
Good. For a Muldoon, it's fantastic.
Auf ein Treppencheck brennt ein Feierl, innen Stiebes heiß. In der Rebellerten kleine Kinder.
Now the person that's singing is the designer of the apartment complex, getting an award.
Here is his prize-winning project. This is the British. It's for this inspirational blending of the past and the future that we proudly honor you with our highest award. Would you say a few words, Mr. Howard?
Auf dem Treppencheck brennt ein Feuer, ist heiß.
Yiddishkeit had become so much a part of the culture that you could take a sitcom and suddenly Molly Pecan is like everybody's grandmother, even though she's singing in Yiddish. Now, finally, Molly returns to Poland, this time in the 1971 film of Fiddler on the Roof, playing the role of Yente. The portrayal of the shtetl finally returns to film for the first time since 1936 at Mitten Fiddle. But this time, the shtetl is no longer there. There is no more shtetl. The shtetl has disappeared. So this film is looking backwards, whereas Mitten Fiddle was reporting on the world before it disappeared. Here we have a scene with Golda and Yentl.
What does that poor skinny tailor want with Zeitel?
They've been friends since they were babies. They talk, they play.
They play? What do they play?
I don't know. They're children.
Oh, from such children come other children.
Mottle is nothing. Yente, you said you had news for me.
Ah, children. They are your blessing in your old age. But my Aaron, may he rest in peace, couldn't give me children. To tell you the truth, Golda, he hardly tried. But what's the use complaining? Other women enjoy complaining, not Yente. Not every woman in the world is a Yente. Well, I have to go home now to prepare my poor Sabbath meal. So, goodbye, Golda. And it was a pleasure talking our hearts out to each other.
Yente, you said you had news for me.
I'm losing my head. Someday it'll fall off altogether, and a horse will kick it in the mud.
A postlude. Pecan became known especially for depictions of meeting and sometimes clashing between members of different Jewish communities. As you can see, the cop, not even the Jewish communities, but of all communities, and also for comic cross-dressing. The first of these themes, cross-dressing, took multiple forms in encounters between Jews of different generations, the themes of meeting and clashing, Jews from the United States and the old country, characters who remained devoutly religious and those who embraced secular values, and more generally, Jewish tradition and modernity. Her performances typically concluded by promoting the embrace of modernity, secularity, and assimilation, although she would never have called it that, as exhibited in her theatrical and filmic narratives as well, and in a hybrid mixture of Jewish and American popular styles heard in many of her songs. Fiddle. At 50, Pecan somersaulted again as the 13-year-old Yankele, as she would do at the age of 80. She said, deep down within me, I was Yankele. I still am. This form of gender bending was a staple in her comic Yiddish productions. Many of her performances combined both of these themes, the romantic coupling of former klezmer performers in urban formal wear and the musical merger of East and West, to echo the title of her silent film dealing with similar themes, indicates that even as Pecan's character leaves the shtetl and traditional Jewish mores about female performance behind for a more modern life in the world, she never loses her devotion to those traditional Jewish mores. Here and elsewhere, her cross-dressing serves more broadly as a metaphor for the social changes being experienced by audiences that came to see her. It was also a potent way of depicting the growing opportunities available to Jewish women in the modern cities of Europe and America that were home to her largest audiences. But ultimately, for me, as an American Yiddish performer, she never forsook her American roots or her Yiddish heritage. Her devotion to both cultures made her a unique force and a beloved one in the American and Yiddish imagination. So I'd be happy to take more questions. And thank you all. I must thank the Jewish Women's Archives, which has an unbelievable treasure trove of media, films, incredible biographies, all of them well notated, all of them deeply thought. The Jewish Women Archives is an amazing resource, and I hope all of you will take some time and visit it.
Thank you, Lynn. That was so wonderful and so rich and so thought-provoking and question-raising, I think. And I see one of my students has a question for you straight away, and this is it. Were any of Molly's performances inspired by her own life, opinions, and experiences?
I don't know that for a fact. I have read her autobiography, and she is she speaks interiorly about her feelings and about her love and about her pain. But I would say that she would not say that they were about her own life. She doesn't talk about it that way in her autobiography. I would say that her own life, she lives her own life through the theater, because that's where her heart and her energy are, and through her devotion to Yiddishkeit. But her own experiences, I would say not so much.
She was clearly, a path breaker and a rule breaker in her films, in her film imagery that you shared with us. And I think, that's where possibly the question that one of my students brought forward came from, because you wonder if she's shaken her stuff, if she's the word is zennius, right, for modesty. Right. She clearly was pushing that boundary in what she was showing the world. She wasn't holding on to, and maybe, as you've made clear, that wasn't where she came from. But because she was Jewish, she was perhaps identified with a kind of a liberatory impulse for women that was also maybe ascribed to Jewish women in particular. I mean, it's just a thought or a question.
Well, when she broke into Yiddish theater, it was, she was unique. The Yiddish theater heroines at that time were large, buxom women who had size and stature, and there was a lot of romantic melodrama in their performances, which is one of the reasons that Molly couldn't get cast on Second Avenue. But when Jacob Kalick came up with this package for her, this Feierdicke Soubrette, this flaming, fiery soubrette, and came up with this package for this petite, non-Yiddish theater female star, she just captured the hearts of Yiddish people and not Yiddish people. Everybody, Fred Gwynn, they all loved her.
It's her life in the theater is just it's extraordinary. The decades that she moved through and obviously reflected in so many unique ways, as you point out. It's such an extraordinary soul and talent, and what I so appreciate is that you bring to light, you illuminate someone that I think for many generations, maybe not for all the generations in the room today, because we have a very multi-generational crew out here, but for some of the younger people, I don't even know if Molly Pecan, the name and the persona, meant anything. So thank you so much for bringing such a rich and nuanced and multi-dimensional portrait of this very important person in American and Yiddish American theater history. It's so important, I think, I would have to say for my students, I know, but also for the community that is able to be here with us today.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, other questions. Anybody? You're getting some very positive comments in the chat. I can see that.
Oh, that's
but are
lovely.
there any other questions out there in the room? Anybody have or a comment that you'd want to share or hear Lynn's response to?
I do. I would like to say one thing that I think is very important. And that is, in order to understand Molly Pecan's life, you have to understand what was going on around her. So you can't look at her through the lens of modern American theater or modern American thought. It's very, very important to read other work about Yiddish America in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. It's very important to read about other Yiddish theater stars and composers and musicians and the history of the Yiddish theater in order to see where Molly Pecan fits in, so that we don't ascribe to her and her life terms that we would use today. In other words, we can't backdate her. So I encourage you all to do some reading and do research to look into what was going on around Molly Pecan. Then you will see how unique she was, but not in terms of what we would have to say. I also think it's important to look at what kind of well, you can speak to this too, Cindy. What kind of, what's the word I could say, ruptures were happening in the Yiddish theater, and what kind of ruptures were happening in Yiddish literature and breaking with the traditional? That is also a part of this story. So that's my entreaty to you, is to find out more about what was happening around her before we start to make, before we apply ourselves to that time.
Thank you. Thank you for putting that thought out there. I completely second it and support it. I know that my students could leap in and give you some examples of what was happening in the 1920s specifically. I'll just throw in, if anybody's interested, there was a play on Broadway called God of Vengeance, written by Sholem Asch, which was so controversial that it, as a result of its first performance, every single performer in the play was hauled off to jail. It was that much of considered to be an outrage. But one thing I also wanted to say is that her cross-dressing is so fascinating. You bring that up throughout her life as a kind of a trope, another way in which she was a path breaker or a rule breaker. But that was happening in the 30s. You know,
Yes, it was.
Catherine Hepburn, Greta Garbo, Tallulah Bankhead, even Clara Bow. These were other women performers that were starting to, you know, to move through and go into a category that we would describe as gender bending. So she was part of a moment, and it's really great to see that was happening in Yiddish theater. That was happening with her. So. Are there any? I see the chat is full of accolades. Are there any other questions that anybody has? Because we're at just about at time. We certainly could take one more if there is. But if there is not, I
see a hand raise. I see
you?
a hand raise. I see a hand raise in the participants, actually.
I see a hand, but that is maybe the comment that I saw earlier on. I'm not sure. Anybody want to leap in with a question? It's best if you go to the chat, just because it'd be easy for me to see your interest. All right, I don't know.
I'll also say, Cindy, that you can get these films. The National Film Archive, Jewish Film Archive, has restored many of them, and you're able to get them and rent them and show them.
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you for the shout out to the Jewish Women's Archive, which is a fantastic resource, as you said. So there is a question here, which is interesting. Did she work when she was older because she wanted to, or was it something about making money that was, you know, part of what she needed to do?
Well, of course, everybody needs to make, you know, everybody needs parnasa. I mean, of course she needed money. But she loved performing. I mean, she performed until she was 85, 86 years old. She was still performing. So I think that she lived on the theater. That was her life, I'm sure.
So if someone is saying that they saw her in Milk and Honey at age 10 and fell in love with her and the theater. So that's a wonderful declaration.
We didn't have time to play the clip where she sings Chin Up Ladies, which is about a bunch of ladies that go over to Israel to find a husband. And so if you have a chance, you can get it on YouTube. Chin Up Ladies, it's hysterical. And she is the group leader. And she made it to Broadway. That's how she made it to Broadway, was in Milk and Honey. She also performed with Barbra Streisand in film of For Pete's Sake. She was on the stage in London with Robert Morley in A Majority of One. And she did a lot of straight theater and English theater.
And how old was she when she did Car 54? Where are you?
You know what? I don't know her exact age, but it was in the early 60s. So
she was in her 70s at that point?
She was probably in her 70s, yeah.
All right. right. Well, I think we're getting the word that the time has come for us to say goodbye. Anyone and everyone in this room, please give us a hand. Throw your hands up for Lynn Torgove.
And
Cantor
thank you
Lynn
so
Torgove,
much
thank
for
you
inviting
so
me.
much.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's been a great, great pleasure to present this for you and to bring Molly.
Wonderful. We hope to have you back to a Hofstra Zoom room soon.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Night.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Athaline.